Your hand indicate that you wish to speak. Please keep your microphone on mute. I should switch mine on, didn't I? When you're not speaking, please can I ask any questions that get brief and to the point. We'll be timing speeches this evening and an alarm will sound when you're speaking for 4 minutes. Right, let's start with the usuals. Apologies for absence and substitutes. Kimberly.
Thank you, Chairman. We have apologies from councillors Edmonds, Keane and Wicks. And just so you're aware, Councillor Spence was elected as a member of the committee yesterday evening, so we welcome him too. Thank you.
We certainly do welcome you. Welcome to the committee. And we have apologies from Councillor Martin as well, Michael Martin. Okay, right, yes, okay, fine. Right, minutes of the last meeting. Committee, can you approve the minutes of the last meeting held on 16th of November and published on the council's website is correct? Thank you. Declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest, Kimberly?
None we've received prior to the meeting, Chair.
And questions from members of the public?
If you're asking whether there are any declarations that we think we might need to declare now, I don't think it would amounts to an interest for which I should declare, but 50 years ago, I used to pick mushrooms when I was about 13 years old with my sister on a Sunday morning at Borrow House Farm. And I haven't liked mushrooms since. I don't know whether this is a, well, not the edible kind anyway. I don't know whether that's an interest, but I was in, just in case anybody remembers and knows and thinks it might affect my decision making.
Oh, okay.
I hope it doesn't.
I don't like mushrooms either, actually, so yeah, I think, well, thank you for that. Questions from members of the public, Kimberly?
None received, Chairman.
And questions from members?
None received, Chairman.
Updates to the government guidance or legislation since the last meeting? Chris?
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. There's just one very brief update. With regards to local plan part 2, members will be aware that the schedule of main modifications following the examination of local plan has been published and is out to public consultation. More weight can therefore be given to the unmodified policies. In terms of the applications tonight, I can confirm that it doesn't have any bearing on any of tonight's recommendations. The consultation runs to Friday, the 27th of January, 2023.
Yes, Councillor Dixon.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to ask the planning officer, we are hearing in the press and in the Houses of Parliament many statements from various MPs and ministers about planning, changes to the planning system. Can you just tell us how that will, or when that might affect us?
Lewis, do you want to go, sir?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm sure members will be aware of the recently published written ministerial statement from the department recently, referring to possible changes to the planning system, some of which relating to 5-year housing land supply, for instance. Our view at the moment is that although it's a material planning consideration, because it's in the form of written ministerial statement, members shouldn't be attaching any weight to it, given the nature of it, given that further consultation is clearly necessary. It doesn't bring into effect any changes to guidance or policy as things currently stand, is our position. So although changes may come forward in the future, I would suggest at the moment it shouldn't have any bearing on members' decision. Thank you.
Councillor Coburn.
I'm just a little bit confused with your wording there when you said it's a material consideration. We should take any notice of it. In the statement, he does say, I will, not I might. Now, I know there's a consultation period, but it is, the whole thing is going to be published before the end of this month. And he does make, statements in his written ministerial statement. It's not something he just put out to the press.
Yeah, apologies, Councillor Coburn. The distinction between whether something is a material planning consideration is separate to then how much weight we should be giving it. So it's a matter of law, if you like, as to whether something is a material planning consideration, but a matter of judgment for the committee as to how much weight we attach to it. Different statements from ministers come in different forms. Some come in the form where it's explicitly stated that they should be read alongside the MPPG and MPPF, for instance, in the sense that they almost immediately bring in guidance that should be read alongside existing national policy. I don't think that's been done here. I do appreciate that, you know, he does say that he will be making changes, but as far as my advice goes, I don't think that we should be relying on it at this stage, just because clearly further work is needed to be done and actual change hasn't been brought forward.
Sorry, thank you. That's much clearer now. I don't wish to labour the point, but you know, this was a ministerial statement from the Secretary of State, which was explaining what he was going to be doing as a planning section, running alongside the Levelling Up Bill. So it was a very precise ministerial statement. As I say, he's made one or two statements to the press, which, you know, wouldn't sort of give any credence to, but this was said very, very clearly, you know, that he will be bringing in changes. And then you're quite right. I mean, nothing will happen until obviously the prospectus has been published. But I do think, you know, it must carry some weight simply because of the phraseology in it.
As I read it, it's a statement of intent, is that correct? And therefore, I don't think we ought to rely on it too much in the situation, but I mean, we bear in mind what has been said, but it's a statement of intent, and really we should be judging these applications on this situation as applies at present. I won't that missing. Can we move on? Church Farnham, GU10 2LB, the erection of 4 dwellings and garages following demolition of buildings and stables, removal of hard standing and sand school with formation of new access road, as amplified by drainage and habitats information received on 29th of June 2022 and 30th of June 2022, flooding information received on 29th of September 2022 and 20th of October 2022, ecology information received on 12th of October 2022, 14th of October 2022, and 31st of October 2022, and amended plans received on the 18th of July 2022 and the 21st of October 2022. And the officer to present is Philippa. Philippa.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. So the application proposes the erection of 4 dwellings and garages following the demolition of buildings and stables, removal of hard standings and sand school, and the formation of a new access road. I draw your attention to the update sheet, which just sets out an amendment to the recommendation, as previously it didn't refer to the legal agreement, which would be required in the event of an approval. So I've just put that there for you. So turning to the application itself, the application site is located at the northern end of the shared access lane adjoining and to the north of Jumps Road in Churt. The site comprises a number of former Nissen hut buildings, a detached 2-storey dwelling known as Borough House Cottage, and a single-storey stable building. The buildings are positioned in 2 groups on the site, with one group sited towards the north and the other to the southern end of the main section. There are large areas of hard standing and a sand school. A tarmac shared access road runs through the site from Jumps Road, and the site also contains areas of open grassland and tree cover. The site surroundings comprise a common to the north and natural vegetation cover to the east and west. The site lies largely within a valley between 2 hills on the east and west. Turning to the aerial view, you can see the site comprises a clearing in the existing woodlands. Here you can see the existing dwelling at Borough House Cottage and a number of redundant buildings to the north. So I've got a number of photographs of the site. These photographs show the existing access from Jumps Road. This photograph shows the existing buildings to the south of the site and the access track as you come into the site. I've provided arrows on the maps each time, so you can hopefully get an idea of where they were taken from. This slide shows existing buildings to the south of the site. And again, these show existing buildings to the south of the site looking west. This slide is looking north towards the existing Borough House Cottage and its garden. This is looking west towards the cottage and the access track, which currently goes around the edge of the dwelling. That's just a picture of the dwelling itself. This slide is looking north past the existing cottage along the access track. This is further along the access track, looking towards the buildings at the north. This is looking back towards the southern area of the site. So the existing dwelling is behind this hedgerow here. This is looking west towards the existing buildings, hard standing and a large retaining wall, which is here. And again, looking north, showing the same buildings. This is also looking north and shows the access track going through here. This is looking east to the existing buildings with the paddock access here. Looking west again towards those buildings and retaining walls. And again there. Again, this is showing the areas, the large areas of hard standing. This is looking north towards the Sand School, which is here, and then towards the northern boundary of the site. This is looking south to the buildings which are there. This is at the very north of the site, looking at the footpath which runs externally to the site, as is this. This is looking west to the existing stable building. And this is slightly further back, again showing the stable building here. Further back again, showing the entrance to the paddock. And this way is looking northeast across the paddock. Okay, this slide shows the existing site plan. Here we can see the buildings as you enter the site here, the existing cottage there, and the array of hard standing and buildings to the north of the site. So the planning history is a material consideration. Outline planning permission has been previously granted at appeal for the erection of 3 dwellings following the demolition of the existing commercial buildings and structures on the site. The outline consent agreed the means of access, the layout and the scale of the development. Landscaping and appearance are reserved matters to be agreed. The associated reserved matters application is currently under consideration with officers. The same appeal decision granted full planning permission for a rear extension and porch at Borough House Cottage. An application to renew this permission is under consideration as well. The combination of the 2 appeal approvals, subject to the approval of reserved matters, would result in 4 residential dwellings on site, the extended and altered Borough House Cottage, as well as the 3 new dwellings. Both permissions were subject to a legal agreement which secured a foul drainage strategy and stipulated that the extensions to the existing dwelling would not be commenced until the demolition of all the other buildings had been completed. Turning to the proposed site plan, here we see the difference between the current proposal and the extant permissions is that the current application proposes the erection of 4 dwellings. The specific differences are the demolition and replacement of Borough House Cottage rather than extending it, the slight realignment of the access road into the site that would serve the 4 dwellings, slight changes to the siting scale and appearance of the proposed dwellings, the inclusion of basement areas, and the addition of a balancing pond to the north of the site, and the inclusion of the paddock to the northeast of the site to allow for a drainage field. So the 4 dwellings would be here, 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 and here. That's just in a bit more detail, the northern area and the southern area of the site. So turning to each plot, so plot 1 is the most southerly plot, and it would appear largely a single story with an element of lower ground floor level built into the slope of the land. There would be a small area of sun deck that would not provide views to Jumps House to the south, and there would be a vegetated roof. There's a couple of visuals there for that dwelling. Plot 2 would replace the existing dwelling at Borough House Cottage. House 2 takes its design cues from the arts and craft movement, of which there are examples of this style in the vicinity. The council's heritage officer provided comments on the original design and recommended a few amendments which have been included in the design before you today. Plot 2 would feature a detached garage and basement. Plot 3 again would appear largely a single story with lower ground levels built into the slope of the land. The roof will be predominantly planted and seeded with heathland species. And plot 4 comprises the area of the existing single-story poor quality stable building and 4 dilapidated Nissan buildings. The stable building itself sits in a depression in the landscape with a significant cutout in the slope to the north and east. The low-lying horizontal form of the proposed dwelling would sit well within this landscape. So turning to the main matters for consideration, as previously noted, the planning history is a material consideration and the principle of development for 4 dwellings, including the existing cottage, is already established. The outline permission granted permission for the layout, scale and access with landscape and appearance as reserved matters, which are currently under consideration in a separate application. The current application seeks the erection of 4 dwellings following the removal of buildings and structures. As such, there would be no net gain of dwellings. In terms of the impact on the Greenbelt, in the assessment of the previous outline application, officers accepted that the area of the application site proposed for development was previously developed land, as defined in the NPPF. The appeal inspector concluded the same. In determining the previous outline application, the inspector concluded that the proposal would occupy the locations of existing buildings and would result in a reduction in the amount of built development currently at the site. Calculations were provided for this application for floor area footprint and above ground volume, which indicate an overall reduction of footprint of built form of 20.5% over the existing situation. Furthermore, there would also be a reduction in both floor area and volume, as well as the number of individual buildings, reducing the overall spread of development across the site. There would also be a significant reduction in hard standing. The current proposal includes below ground basements for each dwellings. Whilst these basements would represent in some cases significant volume, they would not be visible above ground and would therefore not have a greater impact on openness or conflict with the purposes of including land within the Greenbelt. The proposal therefore constitutes appropriate Greenbelt development. In summary, officers are satisfied that the reduction in overall quantity of built form and the concentration of built form into 4 new dwellings would not have a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt. With regard to design, landscape, AONB, AGLB and visual amenity, it's recognised that the application site is located in a particularly high value landscape. The Surrey Hills AONB advisor has set out that arising from the appeal decisions, the AONB advice that related to those decisions, the council's pre-application advice and the high quality of design, that there are no AONB concerns with the latest proposal. In relation to the current proposal, officers are satisfied that the proposed scheme, whilst incorporating the redevelopment of the existing cottage and proposing larger dwellings with below ground level basements and terraces, would have an acceptable appearance in this landscape when compared to the existing situation. With regard to trees, a number of trees would be removed as part of the proposed development. However, it's confirmed that within the submission that no trees of high landscape or biodiversity value are to be removed. A degree of concern is expressed. However, officers consider that a woodland management plan and LEMP, which shows retained trees, could be conditioned as part of the grant of permission, which would enable the woodland to be appropriately managed. With regard to flooding and drainage, the lead local flood authority is satisfied that the proposed drainage scheme meets the relevant requirements and considers that, subject to the suitably worded conditions to ensure that the SUD scheme is properly implemented and maintained, the proposal is acceptable. With regard to the SPA, SAC and SSSI, the site is located within 400 metres of the Wealden Heaths 1 SPA and within the Wealden Heaths special area of conservation. Natural England have been consulted on the current proposal. They consider that without appropriate mitigation, the application would have an adverse effect. However, appropriate mitigation is being put forward and would be secured by a legal agreement as part of this application. As such, no concern is raised. With regard to biodiversity, Surrey Wildlife Trust have assessed the application in detail as set out in the officer report. Subject to the imposition of conditions on any grant of permission, it's considered that the proposal would be acceptable in this regard. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of public speakers. The first one being Richard Nobbs, And Richard, is he online? Oh, here. Richard, aha, you come forward, you have 4 minutes from when you start speaking.
Thank you. Is that going down? Okay, thank you. I sent a briefing note last night from local residents, which you will hopefully have seen. I've got some further copies here, should it be necessary. As the map shows, the site protrudes deep into the flashes of Frensham Common, which is SSI, SAC and SPA, and which is home to many protected species, including a unique stock of smooth snake found nowhere else in the UK. As you know, it is a rare habitat that we are fortunate enough to have in Waverley. Since planning permission was granted in 2017-0928 and 2018-1847, circumstances have changed. Firstly, the passage of time has demonstrated beyond doubt that the site is not viable for commercial use. The site has been acquired as a commercial operation for over 20 years, and in the words of a previous owner, generated around 12 vehicular movements a week, as it was used mainly for storage. Significant commercial activity is not a tenable argument. It's not surprising. The site is isolated, has poor access with a 400-metre narrow single track road with no passing places. In a post-COVID online ordering era, active commercial development is best situated close to main roads. Secondly, we've had an updated NPPF, which provides more weight to avoiding isolated housing and protecting environmentally valuable areas. Thirdly, the proposal is much bigger in size than that for which permission has been granted, with a 31% increase in volume. They now have swimming pools in their surrounds, which also needs to be taken into consideration. House 2, which replaces the cottage, is now massively bigger, as shown in the architect's drawing, which the case officer showed earlier on. Its increased height and size makes it dominant. Fourthly, the sewage drainage field has been moved so it now abuts the SSI of Middle Jump, and in breach of DEFRA general binding rules, which requires a gap of at least 50 metres as an impact protection zone. Finally, we're more aware of our climate change obligations. For example, this means protection of mature trees. There are also some technical matters which, such as whether Church Parish Council have been consulted and the status of planning permission, which expired in August 2022 that I've raised in my note. The changed circumstances means that the traffic analysis is out of date. The development will result in an increase in vehicular movements from 12 a week to somewhere between 150 and 200 movements a week. For isolated large family housing, that's easily achieved. One party commutes to work, the other does a school drop-off and pick-up. Add shopping, online delivery, and social trips, nearly all by car, and all through the narrow single access road with no passing places, and an egress which Surrey Highways has acknowledged is unsafe. Whilst on the surface these are eco houses, they have swimming pools which require lots of energy to heat. They are much larger than necessary, and with more inhabitants they will significantly increase the intensity of use and so the openness of the green belt. Large family houses will create more noise, light and other pollution and sewage close to the centre of an environmentally sensitive area that requires low nutrient levels. The application should be refused. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up is Mike De Courcy, which is speaking in support of the application. Mike, you do have 4 minutes when you start speaking.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank the case officer for a very thorough introduction to this scheme, and I apologise if I repeat some of the points. The principle of the erection of 3 dwellings to replace the current 18 commercial buildings, stables and menage on the site was established with the granting of the outline planning permission in 2019. This permission remains extant with the approval of reserved matters application currently with officers for determination. Some of the objectors, including the previous speaker, have objected to the principle of development and its impact on the nature conservation, drainage, highway safety and openness of the greenbelt. All these matters were considered thoroughly by the appeal inspector, who granted outline consent and was satisfied that development not cause harm and would be appropriate development in the greenbelt. With regard to the impact of the development on the adjacent SAC and SSSI, both Natural England and Surrey Wildlife Trust have scrutinised this application extremely carefully. They raised no objection to the scheme in terms of the proposed drainage and its impact on the adjoining protected habitat. The Highway Authority has raised no objection in view of the findings of the appeal inspector, who considered the dwellings would result in substantially lower traffic movements compared with the lawful commercial use of the site. In greenbelt terms, the development would result in a reduction in the amount of built development on the site by 20.5%. And a reduction in above ground volume by 11.8%. There would also be a reduction in the amount of development, the developed area by 23%, introducing significant new green space within the development. Officers agree that the scheme would not have a greater impact on the openness of the development of the green belt. The policy test within the NPPF is therefore satisfied, and the development therefore represents appropriate development in the green belt. The proposed development would not materially change the impact of the development on the AONB compared with the previous scheme. It is noted that the AONB officer raises no objection to the application and considers the scheme to be of a high quality design. The submitted landscape and environmental management plan will ensure that the landscape structure of the site is enhanced and would deliver a net gain of 14.6 habitat units, which more than satisfies the 10% uplift set out in the Environment Act. This scheme represents an approach to the reuse of this site, which combines high quality architecture, a sensitive approach to landscape, and a positive contribution to biodiversity in a single application to provide residential development of exceptional quality. For these reasons, we urge the committee to support the officer recommendation. Thank you.
Ward councillors now wish to speak, I believe. And first is Julia Potts and David Munro. Julia Potts, I believe you wish to go first.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, and Councillor Munro intends to sum up. Good evening, Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you very much for your time this evening on this complex application. And you've seen in the report, I'm sure already, that my reasons for calling this in. What I would start by asking and draw to members' attention is that we have a report coming to the Eastern Committee next week about draft local plan part 2, where it states that having been subject to consultation and examination, the inspector's comments that have been received on the main modifications, the plan, though it does not form part of the development plan, does now carry material weight in decision making. So I would ask for some clarity, and I would suggest members may wish to look at page 10, section 7, the first paragraph, because surely this is now a material consideration when we come to looking at this particular application. And in terms of policy, I actually would also like some further clarification here on the council's published climate change SPD. What weight is being given to it, please? It is also part of LPP2. And I think we need to be really clear with this application in terms of consistency of policy approach. Now, given the drainage concerns, especially given the proximity to such an important SSSI, I've looked through the report. We haven't really got anything concrete from a number of statutory authorities. There is mitigation given. There are flood ponds and so forth, but in actual fact, I don't feel that enough detail has been given to this aspect of such an important part of this application, and I find that very concerning. Page 17 of your report, members, again, the last paragraph around Greenbelt. I find it questionable as to whether these are appropriate, and it is appropriate development in the Greenbelt. I would especially question the use of the basements, because again, we know the impact that can have on such a delicate ecosystem, and again, the actual water table. So again, that concerns me, and I would ask that that be probed far more by you as a committee. Page 24, paragraphs 1 to 5 refer to trees. We know there's going to be significant tree felling at this site. There will be, and I quote from the report, minor root incursion. Well, what exactly does that mean? What impact does that mean on the trees that are trying to be saved? And indeed, I would ask that we probe that far more thoroughly, because those trees are significant, again, for that whole ecosystem in such a sensitive area of our borough. Paragraph 3 of page 26, Surrey Highways do raise a number of concerns, and I would suggest members read paragraph 3 of page 26 extremely careful, because it states, as our speaker has already said, about the isolation of the site, that they deem it in contravention of policy. And then
24 minutes, Mr. Potts.
thank you. Then they go on to actually contradict that in the report. So again, I'm really concerned about that. And finally, page 32, and the impact on our reptiles and the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust's comments, which again raise very serious concerns. So to my mind, given the complexities, can I ask that members please probe these areas carefully and defer or refuse this application this evening?
Okay, thank you. Well, Councillor Monroe, you'll have to wait till you'll have found the end of the 4 minutes, I'm afraid. Right, Councillor, do you want to
I'll obey the rules, of course.
Of course, yes. Councillors, who wishes to speak first? Anybody? Oh, Councillor Dixon, then Councillor James, and Councillor Neil. Dixon, Councillor Dixon.
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much, Chairman. I'll go first. Okay, so I think there's 3 things that jump out at me about this application. Obviously, this is in the Greenbelt, and we're trying to decide whether or not this is inappropriate development. And when you look at plot number 2, it's quite clear that several of the houses are being built underground. The plot number 2, I think I'm right, is the very big one that's being built above ground, and it's substantially bigger than the farmhouse that was there before. So I feel that because of the size of that, although, and I know we've been presented with a lot of charts and a lot of mathematics showing us 11% here and I don't know, some other percentage somewhere else, it's a massive big house that they're building in the green belt. Also, I would say that the developers haven't looked at the revised design guidelines, which Farnham has produced. And we are looking for, Farnham Town Council is saying we don't want modern houses. We would like the character of Farnham to be maintained. So,
This is in Frensham, actually.
okay, I did wonder whether, okay, so we'll scrap that bit. So first of all, Greenbelt, and then the third one is diversity. On pages 31 and 32, there are mentions of badgers, birds, bats, great crested newts, and reptiles. And then within the reptiles, they mention adder, common lizard, slow worm, grass snakes, and sand lizards. There's no mention of the rare population of smooth snake that our guest speaker mentioned. So I do wonder whether or not the biodiversity has been correctly assessed. So I will, at the moment, I don't feel like I can agree to this planning application. Thank you.
Councillor James?
Thank you, Chairman. Could the officers on page 19, whilst on plot 2 is the one I'm concerned with, what is the actual overall increase in size within the green belt? Because we have a size that we allow. This seems to be much bigger than I think we should allow. I've rung, the cottage's floor area is 167. The new one is 523. Well, that's goodness knows what. Footprint 92. Now it's 206. Volume 452, and now it's 1,380 plus some underground. I bought a 2-bedroom cottage in Chiddingfold to the committee because it was in the green belt and they wanted to rebuild it, and we categorically refused it because it was too big. So if I bought it back and they wanted to build an underground basement, I presume now we're going to set a precedent, and anything in the green belt, they can build a basement, and we're not going to use that as part of the size, because that house looks to me enormous compared to the cottage that was there. So I would like to, just an ordinary, simple, how much bigger is it than that which is there? Thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So if we were assessing the dwelling on its own, we would be doing a different test. It would be, is it materially larger than the existing dwelling? But we've assessed the site as a whole in terms of the current built form, floor area, hard standing, volume, and what it would be replaced with. So officers have concluded that the whole development as a whole would result in a significant reduction in volume and floor area, etc.
Whilst that's what you've done, I've got no plan. The 3 houses have been agreed at appeal, so I will agree with that. We're now looking at, in my view, on this agenda, plot 2, which has permission for an extension and everything else. So I'm looking at plot 2. I want to know what the volume increase in plot 2 is compared to the cottage, and does it agree with our policies on how much bigger we can build a cottage in the countryside in green belt. Forget the 3 that have already got permission on appeal, because this house hasn't gone to appeal. It's got permission for an extension. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So I don't have the volume figure, but if we look at this slide, it's quite faint, but there are red dashed lines where the existing dwelling would be. So I'm struggling to point to it. Hopefully you can see the dashed red lines. Also, if I just quickly go to the end of my presentation. That is the elevations of the cottage with its extensions. So I'm afraid I don't have a volume figure, because that is not the assessment that we've done here, because we've talked about it as a redevelopment of the whole site rather than in separate parts like the inspector did previously. Thank you.
John, Councillor Potts' points.
Yes, thank you, Chair. In terms of the local plan part 2, I did give an update at the beginning. So yes, we are now attaching more weight to the unmodified elements of policy. But in terms of this application, I don't feel that those policies have made any alteration to our recommendation. But yes, Councillor Potts is correct that as we move towards a more as we move further towards adoption, certain policies have to carry more weight. The climate change SPD, yes, that is now a material consideration, and we are, for new applications that are coming in, we're asking that a checklist is completed, and so it is a material consideration. In terms of, there was some mention of the basements. Now these are subterranean basements, and we haven't had any other. There's no indication that those would cause any issue in terms of the water table or anything along those lines. So and with regards to trees, it should also be noted that there's obviously been a consent already in certain locations on the site, and there is a condition attached to that inspector's decision to do with tree protection. So we'd be recommending a similar condition. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Councillor Neil and Councillor Coburn.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask the Officer Philippa for a couple of questions, please, to clarify. Is there any public right-of-way through the site? I presume not for vehicles, but for walkers. That's one question. I'll run through them all. So, in other words, is it just access to the site itself at the moment? Second point was that I noticed in French and Paris Council comments, it says, the proposal is not in keeping with the density of existing houses. I'm not quite sure what that means. Does that imply it's denser or it's less dense? Because I presume these are fairly big houses in that area. And one of the speakers talked about commercial development. I might have misunderstood what he said, but there's no commercial development included within this, is there? It's all residential, I assume. So I'm really trying to get an understanding of who is using the access road or is going to be using it. We've had talk of a high number of vehicle movements. That seemed a bit of a high number to me for residential properties. So I just wondered if you could clarify those points, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So no, there's no right of way going through the site, but there are some around the boundaries, but not within the site. I don't know what French and Parish Council mean with regards to density, but there are large dwellings in the vicinity. So, but I don't really know what they mean in that regard. And in terms of the commercial development, so the site once upon a time was a mushroom farm, and could be used again for commercial development without seeking any additional permission to do so. They could intensify the use of it, the vehicle movements, etc., should they wish to do so.
Is there no commercial use at the moment?
No, it's not being used in that way at the moment, but it could return to that
I see.
without the need for further permission.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Coburn.
Thank you, Chairman. If you just look at the long history on 8 and 9 and goodness knows how many pages after that, there's been a huge long history on this site and many site visits. And when the application came in for the 3 that was refused, it was refused because we felt that it was too much, for what we weren't opposed to development on this site. And in fact, if you look at what we say on page 18, even though it was refused, it got through on appeal. Officers accepted that the area of the application site proposed for development was previous developed land. The appeal inspector concluded the same, And in determining the previous outline application, he concluded the proposal would occupy the locations of existing buildings. You know, we'd almost got to the point where the inspector and officers were thinking 3 is your absolute max if you're going to not create any extra harm. This is where this is so disappointing because, you know, when things go through on appeal, you have to accept it. That's not an issue. And we have to do our best then at the reserve matters stage to get something on that site which follows our policies and which creates the least harm. And I am worried about putting this for the way this is being done and the impact it is going to have on these sites of special interest that we have. I mean, it is a particularly special site. We said that when we first went on well, say first went, when we've been on several site visits, because, you know, I mean, all sites are unique, but it is by virtue of where it is, very, very sensitive. And I feel this, we're almost criticizing ourselves. You know, we're almost saying that 3 seem to be acceptable. We're now working on that. We think we can achieve something with 3. And this 4th one seems to me just to push it to a more harmful development in the green belt than was given permission at appeal, and which actually as a committee, we would never have. We refused 5, didn't we? We refused, you know, we refused the 3, and it was the appeal, the inspector that allowed them. So, you know, to be consistent, it's not that I'm against development on this site, I'm not against the 3 that's got permission, but I do think this is really pushing the limit of acceptability on a site that's so sensitive. And we cannot, by putting this amount of built form and the sheer size of all this is just going to take away an awful lot of the green space. So, you know, we're bound to harm biodiversity. We just can't do it any other way. There's no way you can build a house and preserve all the biodiversity on the site you're building on. It just doesn't work. So personally, I'm leaning to thinking this is just a step too far with this one. And I wish they would just work with you on the, you know, the approval they've got and get something really acceptable on this site.
Thank you. I think the officers want to just clarify something.
Yeah, just as a point of clarification, I think we all understand, but it is it's still a net increase of 3. So the reason that's referred to as 4 dwellings is because one of the dwellings that is already on site is to be replaced. But I think we're all aware of that, but I just want to make sure.
Councillor Dear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, this obviously is a very, you know, very sensitive site, but a lot of the concerns that we would normally have, or if this was on application, have been addressed at the inspector's decision, as far as I can see. I mean, clearly the principle of development's established, and the bit that we've just been talking about is a replacement of a building that's there. It's not another new building on top. I had a concern until very recently, within the last half an hour or so, that Natural England hadn't responded on anything because nothing of theirs was on the website. But I now see that they, subject to the appropriate mitigation, seem to think that's going to be acceptable. As do Surrey Wildlife Trust. They expressed themselves, I suppose, as they have to at this point, in fairly broad terms, but there needs to be some very specific and very carefully enforced, to my mind, environmental mitigations because of the nature. You know, an SSSI is a pretty rare thing, and you know, it's something that really should be regarded with the highest importance. And I don't feel comfortable about this in many ways, but given the planning history, given the inspector's decision, given the replacement of one building by another of arguably more attractive quality and design, and the fact that you can build in biodiversity. You can take the opportunity by investing in the landscape to create habitats that don't presently exist. And we're told as part of this package that that's what's proposed. So I'm not comfortable. I'm not pleased, but I can't see any material reason to turn down the application that's in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Hess.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I rather follow the line of thinking that Councillor Dear just put forward. It's already got outline permission granted. It's reducing the built development by 20.5%. and the new house to replace the existing property, which looking at the drawings or elevations shown on screen, look like a house that, to my mind, looks poorly insulated, quite an old house, huge, great big conservatory, leaking heat. The new house would be built to current building regulation standards to a superior standard of insulation, be far more environmentally sustainable in that respect. And, you know, when we talk about newts and snakes and all the creatures that live upon the land, if the owner of the site decided to demolish the structures which are already there, which you could probably do without having to get any permission from anybody, he'd disturb the snakes and the newts and whatever's running around. They'd have to push off into the remaining woods. So he could do that. You know, anything you do on that site will disturb the biodiversity for a period of time. And we in this chamber all know that we were perfectly happy to grant permission to the filming in Bourne Woods, which is not that far away, and think about all the thunder flashes and the warriors running around disturbing the biodiversity. We're happy with that. But here it's special, SSSI and all the rest of it. And we've got to treat the creatures on the land in a far more sensitive way. But over in Bourne Woods, doesn't really matter. You can have explosions and helicopters and God knows what going off. We seem to have a kind of split personality when it comes to biodiversity. So you build these new houses, nature will move back in again. We all know that in reality. That frankly doesn't concern me too much. So as far as the existing outline permission, I don't think we can argue too hard on that. And the new house looks like a quality building. And as I said, probably much better insulated, etc. So I would probably support this one.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Councillor.
Chair.
I think you have to remind everybody that we're dealing with, we have to deal with this application as it is, rather than doing comparisons. Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Chairman. So I don't want to repeat anything that's been said already. There are a number of concerns people have raised, particularly the transport issues and the issue of isolation. The effect on the SSSIs is, to me, the single biggest issue here. As Councillor Deere has said, that we do need further information, or we need to make sure that, that there are protections in place. I disagree with him in terms of his statement that the principle is established, because principles can't be established unless they're established lawfully in terms of the protections, lawful legislative protections that we have for endangered species and endangered habitats. We've on page 28 and 29, they talk about the effects on the SBA's SAC and the SSSIs, French and Thursley, Hankley. And it tells us that it was refused by the council originally on those grounds. The inspector concluded that harm needed to be mitigated. It went through the system. What we do know is, as an absolute matter of fact, that amongst there is no list, or that there is no mention of mitigation of the in combination impact of increased visitor pressure. It's got mitigation of various issues, but which can affect the SSSIs, but nothing about mitigation of income impact of urbanisation and increased visitor disturbance. We know for a fact that the People over Wind judgment, which we've had referred to many times, confirmed that Natural England and LPA's evasion of appropriate assessments of mitigation is not a lawful approach. So we know that, I mean, we know Natural England and Surrey Wildlife Trust have said they've removed their objections, but they've been doing that for 15 years. And according to the law, that is not a lawful approach that they've taken. So we have to take their removal of objections with a pinch of salt and actually look at the facts. Is there or is there not mitigation? So from what we see here, there is no mitigation mentioned of the urbanisation and increased visitor disturbance. So I want to ask officers, whereabouts have we got details, which are people over wind compliant, assessment of the mitigation of increased visitor disturbance? Because I think that's, I haven't seen any. So it is a genuine question. I don't know whether there is any, whether there's any mitigation plan for increased urbanisation and visitor disturbance. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. This is slightly unusual situation in terms of the dwellings being within the 400-metre zone, but there's an existing consent where this was already considered, and the points that we consented that the habitat regulations assessment for the local plan referenced 40 dwellings that could come forward in that zone without resulting in a significant effect. So that is why these dwellings were consented the first time around, and then obviously you can't build out both both the consented scheme and this scheme. So for those reasons, Natural England have confirmed they're not raising any objection on increase in population in this position. There is also a more detailed package of mitigation in relation to the SPA that relates more towards the physical impacts of the development. So there's a drainage strategy that is secured via a legal agreement. So both of those things have been looked at by us and by Natural England, and therefore we're of the opinion that there's no resulting impacts.
Chairman, can I just point out then, in response to that, thank you very much, that what Natural England agreed to in respect of saying that they could cope with 40 homes or whatever, that from the local plan, that was prior to the People Over Wind ruling, which says actually you can't take that approach, you can't evade assessments, you can't just assume that it's going to be okay without providing evidence to show. So as that was before, that was local plan part 1, which we still don't have a compliant appropriate assessment for, because that was again before the April 2018 judgment. So we've just had confirmation that we do not have an assessment of mitigation. We don't have any mitigation of that impact. So I can't vote for this, and lawfully nobody else can. Thanks.
Well, that's a big, we come back to the same argument all the time. I mean, I think we do have an assessment, yes.
Only briefly, Chairman, just I would say that the 40 unit figure referred to in the AA and agreed with Natural England is in effect a screening decision, really, to say that they do not consider that number of dwellings would be likely to have a significant effect on the SPA. So it comes before the requirement, or it doesn't trigger the requirement for an AA, and therefore doesn't trigger all of the implications that come with Sweetman. So I'm happy with the officer report in that respect.
Chairman, that was the whole point of People Over Wind is you can't make those screening judgments anymore. I mean, that was the whole point. You can't evade assessment. So I think we really need to sort this out. It's getting ridiculous, because when it says in the National Planning Practice Guidance quite clearly that competent authorities must now assess the robustness of mitigation through an appropriate assessment. Must now means we've got to change our ways. I mean, that was saying that it's the approach is.
We've been over this many times.
Yes, and people aren't listening, and people won't look at the facts and won't read it for themselves, Chairman. And I think it's about time that we had an admission that actually we have to assess it, and we haven't. It's not that difficult.
We've been so many times, and we know what our position is as a council, and well, that's it. We cannot keep going on. Anyway, Councillor Neil.
Thank you. So where I am standing at the moment bearing in mind the existing permission that exists on the site and the fact that it seems to be a sensitive development to me, and the build quality I'm told is good standard. And it removes some obsolete buildings, which probably takes away the incentive to turn it back to a commercial area. Highway access, I don't feel concerned about. Biodiversity looks as if they're going to incorporate improvements, just looking at the way they're laying out the site and everything. So I'm minded to support the application. Thank you.
Any other councillor wish to speak who hasn't spoken before? Right, okay, right. You ward councillors, Councillor Potts, you had a full 4 minutes this time. Do you want to add anything, or should I give Mr Munro his 4 minutes?
Please give Mr Munro his 4 minutes. Thank you.
Mr Munro, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. A very serious debate on a very serious subject, but I did pick up quite a number of concerns, if I could just summarise them one by one. First of all, plot 2. It would seem certainly some members, of course, felt that it was the wrong type of design for this sensitive site, particularly the basements. I hope the committee will take that into account. Serious concerns about the access and the transportation issues, the number of movements, which local people who know the area very well indeed, of course, are also worried about. The Natural England submission, while it came down in the end to agreeing with this, subject to stringent commission conditions, if you read it paragraph by paragraph, they do have very serious concerns about monkeying around really with this extremely sensitive site. So I do hope that's taken seriously into account by members here. And we have had a comment on reptiles, the smooth snakes as an example of the extreme sensitivity here. My own view, Chairman, and I know local people agree with this, although naturally we have to accept the previous planning history here and the appeal. We can't just leave this site. What is the committee is being asked to accept is a fundamental change to what is there at the moment. And I do hope they will very seriously consider whether these changes are basically just a step too far and changing what is there at the moment with what could be here if you agree this planning application. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Right, the recommendation I have before me is slightly different from the one you had on the screen. Could you put your one up on screen, please? That subject to the applicant entering into an appropriate legal agreement in 6 months of the resolution to grant to secure the implementation and future maintenance of the drainage facilities, and subject to the conditions listed below, permission be granted, and recommendation be that in the event there's a section 106 agreement required by recommendation is not completed within 6 months of the date of the resolution to grant permission be refused. Those in favour, please raise their hands. Those against, oh sorry, did you count those? Those against? And abstain. The result, please, Kimberly.
Thank you, Chairman. That is 8 in favour, 3 against and 1 abstention. Therefore, it's a carried.
Yes, thank you very much. Drop over.
Chairman, may I ask for a 1 minute break? If it's
Yeah, go on. We've got, yeah, 1 minute, literally 1 minute. Yeah, well, you know what I mean. I think we are set up here anyway, aren't we?
We're all set up.
We are set up, my
We're all
word.
set up.
Okay, Councillor Hyman's back, so we can start. The next application, WA 2021-02902, the land at Monkton House, Monkton Lane, Farnham. That land application with all matters reserved except access to the erection of up to 56 dwellings, of which 40% is affordable. And Ruth Dovich present. Ruth.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. Just before I start, I'd like to draw your attention to an update sheet that you should have in front of you. Effectively, there's an amendment to the heads of terms in the section 106, just to ensure that the landscape and ecological management plan Thank you. Right. So the First Amendment relates to the heads of terms. There is a condition that requires a landscape and ecological management plan in the agenda report, but we're also including that within the heads of terms of the section 106. There's just a correction to an error in the table on page 81 that relates to the housing mix. There is the provision of additional condition that relates to a further noise report to be provided along with any potential mitigation measures as part of reserved matters application. So there is an amendment to the recommendation to incorporate the changes to the section 106 that I've outlined above and that additional condition 32. I also have a further update because you may have noticed on the agenda report that the recommendation is subject to the Environment Agency raising no objection to the development. And that is in relation to the fact that the site is within a ground source protection area zone 1. I heard from the Environment Agency this afternoon that they have no concerns in that respect, and I will take you through the detail on that when I get to that point in the presentation. So turning to the presentation. So the site is located on the south side of Monkton Lane. You have Webburn Road on the eastern side of the site and Hale Road on the western side of the site. Apologies for the rather wobbly green line here, but that effectively indicates the built up area boundary. So the site is right by the built up area boundary. It's within countryside beyond the green belt, and it's in an area of strategic visual importance, and that relates effectively to ensuring that there is no coalescence between various parts of Farnham. So this is an aerial photograph, and you can see the application site here, which effectively is a green field. You can see the context in which it sits. I've already mentioned the fact that the settlement boundary is over here, so you can see development in this area. We have the Six Bells roundabout here, sewage treatment works here, and the David Lloyd Gym here. There are some allotments that are located on the southern boundary of the site. Oh, sorry. So effectively the site is a green field, and it's got quite a lot of screening around it on each of the boundaries. There is a TPO'd oak tree, and it's just here on the northern boundary, and you can see you've got a number of residential dwellings here. So these are some photographs that are taken from within the site. So this photograph is effectively taken in the centre, looking back to the residential properties that I mentioned. Photograph B is taken looking towards the western boundary of the site, towards Hale Road. There are some trees and some hedging on that boundary and quite a wide verge beyond. Photograph C is taken from the centre of the site, looking towards the east and towards Webburn Lane. You can just about see, and you'll see them all clearly in other photos, that there's an electricity pylon there, and there are some electricity lines that run along the southern boundary of the site. So again, this photo is taken within the site, and that's the TPO'd oak tree that I've mentioned. This image is taken within the centre of the site, looking along the southern boundary. So there's quite a degree of tree screening. And again, you can see those electricity lines. So this photograph is taken from outside the site, looking towards the northeastern corner. And that photograph is significant because there will be some highway improvement works there, which would result in the loss of 3 trees in order to increase the width of the pavement. And I'll take you through those proposals later. So these, the first 2 photos, G and H, are looking down Monkton Lane. This is effectively adjacent to the houses neighbouring the site, and this is further on in. So the site boundary is here, and you can see there's vegetation on the boundary. Photograph I is taken from Hale Road, and you can see effectively vegetation on the boundary there, and you may not be able to pick it up from that photo there, but the wide verge that I referenced earlier. So the application is an outline application for 56 dwellings with all matters reserved except for access. So this plan in front of you now is an indicative master plan. So it effectively shows an arrangement of dwellings as a mix of detached, semi-detached and small terraces of 3. And there's a range of between 1 and 4 bedroom dwellings, and the precise mix is outlined in the report. This area here at on the southern boundary of the site, this is where potential suds basins could go, and this could be a potential leap. Now it's just worth noting that the built form in this indicative master plan does sit away from these power lines here. The plan also shows the accesses to the site, so there'd be a new pedestrian and vehicle access onto Monkton Lane. There's also the potential to create a new vehicle access here for these 3 dwellings if they came forward in that layout. There is a pedestrian access proposed onto Monkton Lane here, and you can see that in tandem with that, it would be proposed to provide a new bit of pavement here, which would then connect in to this bit of existing pavement on the north side of Monkton Lane to take pedestrians out to Webburn Road. There is a pedestrian and cycleway that goes all the way through the site that connects Webburn Road and Monkton Lane to Hale Road here. So these are the highway works that I mentioned in more detail. Sorry, the plan isn't orientated as the master plan was, but effectively this is the northeastern corner of the site. So the pavement would be widened here to be a shared pedestrian and cycleway. So that would be required to be 3 meters wide. So in order to achieve that, you would need to remove some of the vegetation on this boundary. And in association with that, the Highway Authority have also negotiated a new pedestrian refuge. And in order to achieve the pedestrian refuge, you would need to widen the highway. So this grey shaded area here indicates where the highway would be widened. So in essence, that would result in a 2 meter wide pedestrian refuge here, and either carriageway would be 3 meters wide. And then the existing pedestrian crossing here would just be moved slightly further along. It's actually south, be moved further south to align with that pedestrian refuge. So the planning history to this site is a significant material consideration. So there was an outline application for 56 dwellings that was refused in 2016. That application proposed a 40% affordable housing provision, which amounted to 22 dwellings. The key reasons for refusal related to impact on the countryside, impact on the area of strategic visual importance, and concern about the housing mix. So that was appealed, and there was an inquiry in February 2017, and the inspector concluded that the development should be approved. And I think it's important when looking at the history that everyone has an understanding of the sort of policy shifts that sort of take place through the course of events and where we are now in terms of policy, to understand the rationale for the recommendation for approval of the application. So at the time the inspector recommended approval, the council had no up-to-date local plan. It was pre-local plan part 1, and there was no Farnham neighbourhood plan in place. The council didn't have a 5-year housing land supply, so the tilted balance was therefore engaged. So that's not to say that development plan policies aren't relevant. It's just to say that you have to put less weight on those and more weight to the benefits of the scheme. So the inspector identified no material harm to the area of strategic visual importance. He didn't consider that the scheme resulted in coalescence, and he put limited weight on the slight adverse landscape impact. And as a result of that, he recognised there was a conflict with the development plan in terms of that's the Secretary of State. So effectively, the benefits of the proposal outweighed the harm on the tilted balance. So then that decision got called in by the Secretary of State, and he dismissed the appeal in March 2018. And there are some key policy changes that sat behind the Secretary of State's rationale for that. And they were that the local plan part 1 had been adopted and the Farnham neighbourhood plan was made. So our policy position was much stronger. The council could also demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, so the tilted balance wasn't engaged. So the Secretary of State agreed with the inspector from 2017 that there was no material harm to the area of strategic visual importance. And he put moderate weight on the harm to the character and appearance of the area there, essentially the countryside. And he also put substantial weight on the location of the development outside the built-up area boundary, having regard to paragraph 198 of the NPPF. I've set out paragraph 198 in this slide because it is particularly significant because that paragraph stated that where a planning application conflicts with the neighbourhood plan, planning permission will not normally be granted. So there was quite a clear message there that supported the neighbourhood plan policies very clearly. We're now looking at this application in a different policy context, as I'm sure many of you are aware. We don't have a 5-year housing land supply, and therefore the tilted balancing is engaged. And we no longer have paragraph 198. This has been replaced with paragraph 14. So what paragraph 14 does is it does afford neighbourhood plans a greater level of protection, but that when you're in a tilted balance scenario, but that is dependent on certain criteria, one of them being that the local plan must be less than 2 years old. And in this particular situation, the Farnham neighbourhood plan is more than 2 years old, and therefore the extra layer of protection afforded by paragraph 14 is no longer in place. And we no longer have paragraph 198 in place. So it's just important, I think, because the planning history is so important in terms of the recommendation on the application, and it is a significant material consideration. I've just put up these just the comparative schemes, really. So the 2015 application was a full detailed planning application. So what you see in terms of that master plan, that would have been built out as proposed had it been approved. And you can just see there's a bit more development on the southern boundary. The access points are relatively similar. And then this is the proposed indicative master plan, but that could be subject to change at the reserved matters stage. But essentially they propose the same number of dwellings, and they propose the same, in fact, this application proposes 1 additional affordable housing unit. So this slide is really aimed at sort of setting out whether the proposal is in accordance with the development plan or not, because that is still a consideration in the tilted balance, coupled with the material considerations, and moving on to the benefits of the proposal that have to be weighed into the considerations. So in terms of the location of the development, it's immediately adjacent to the settlement boundary and considers to be in a sustainable location, and that has been established through the appeal process on the previous scheme. I'll leave landscape impacts till the end. There are some, and I meant to point those out on the aerial photo, so apologies for that, but there are some listed buildings around the Hale Road and Upper Hale Road junction, but there is no harm identified to the setting of those assets. The Highway Authority has raised no objections to the proposal subject to conditions and those highway improvement works. There are the loss of 3 trees on the northeastern boundary of the site, but the tree officer doesn't raise any objection to those. They don't, they're not significant specimens, and 2 of them are ash trees that have ash dieback. The market housing provision in terms of the mix would accord with our requirements. There's quite a broad mix. The proposal would provide 40% affordable housing, so 10% over and above our policy requirement. I've just referenced the electricity lines in there because I thought they might be concerned about the proximity of development to those, and SSE have advised that they don't have any objection. There would be a requirement that if the play area is located in the vicinity of the power lines, that you couldn't have kite flying or balls being played with. And the way to overcome that would be to have signs up so people were aware of that. And then I think it's worthwhile just touching on flooding and drainage in a bit more detail. So the site is not, in terms of flood zones, it's in flood zone 1, so it's not vulnerable to river flooding. In terms of groundwater flooding, there isn't any evidence of groundwater flooding on the site as advised by the lead local flood authority, but we are recommending a condition that further geotechnical data on groundwater levels would be provided at the reserve matters stage to inform the detailed design, and that is condition 24 on your agenda report. In terms of surface water, it's in a low risk area for surface water flooding other than 2 overland routes. So we do not have any concern that once the development is undertaken and SUDs are provided, that there would be any harm in this respect. The other matter to touch on is the fact that it is in a level 1 ground source protection zone. We have had discussions with the lead local flood authority about this, and they raised no objection on the basis that the SUDs wouldn't be infiltrating into the ground. And the Environment Agency have confirmed today that they would only have concerns about this if it was a contaminating use and they don't consider the existing use, which is a green field, or the proposed use to be a contaminating use. So they haven't raised any concerns. In terms of biodiversity, the Surrey Wildlife Trust have raised no objection, and there is the potential for biodiversity net gain to be achieved of approximately, effectively in the origin of 10%. And through the provision of financial contributions, it's considered the effect on the Thames Basin Heath SPA would be mitigated for. So in terms of everything I've spoken about so far, the proposal would, the proposal would accord with the development plan. Where it would conflict is in relation to those landscape impacts that I mentioned when we were talking about the previous appeal. So there is a conflict with policy RE1 and RE3 of the development plan, and FMP 10 and FMP 11 of the Farnham neighbourhood plan. However, taking into account the previous appeal inspector's decision, where we didn't have a 5-year housing land supply, and he was recommending approval on the basis that the landscape impacts were limited, and taking into account the benefits of the scheme, which would be the provision of market housing and an over provision in relation to the policy of affordable housing at a time when we don't have sufficient housing land supply, coupled with other benefits like the potential biodiversity improvement and potential economic benefits that would flow through from the development, officers of the view that the harmful impacts of the development would not significantly outweigh the benefits, and approval is recommended. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Right, we have public speakers on this item, and starting with Catherine Powell. I think, Catherine, you have 4 minutes from when you start speaking.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, councillors. Good evening. Thank you for your time. I've been asked by residents to speak on their behalf to object to this development and request that you refuse this application. The site conflicts with the Farnham neighbourhood plan. It's not an allocated site and it's outside the built-up area boundary. The officers recommend you grant this as Waverley lacks a 5-year housing land supply and the neighbourhood plan is more than 2 years old, which in their view outweigh the limited harm that in their opinion arises from this proposal. This does not agree with the Secretary of State's assessment that moderate weight be attached to the harm. In my view and the view of over 40 local residents, even this assessment is wrong. This proposed development will create significant harm to the general character and appearance of the area in direct conflict with policies 10 and 11. The updated plan makes it clear that the developer has no regard for the proximity of listed buildings, including the beautiful St. John's Church or their setting. The impact is actually much worse in the recent proposals as more of the mature trees are removed, further opening up the site, and this is not reflected in most of the documents that have been submitted by the developer. The officers effectively state themselves that this site cannot be screened because of the overhead cables. Other reasons to refuse. The NPPF was updated in 2021 to take further account of climate change, and the flood risk assessment guidance continues to be updated, the latest update being in August 22 this year. Any development on this site will have a material impact on the ability to retain or indeed improve local surface water flood risk resilience. Monkton Lane turns into a stream when it rains. This is one of the few remaining fields upstream of the valley in which Farnham sits, and which could be retained for resilience and to mitigate the increased flood risk on the rest of the town. Development would therefore be in conflict with NPPF paragraph 153. This is a material change since the last time this site was refused. The SUDS drainage design guidance only deals with rainfall onto the site. Surface water runoff from elsewhere is never taken into account. This is a serious shortcoming in the current legislation. Waverley's strategic flood risk assessment identifies this area as having the highest number of sewage flood risk incidents in the whole of Waverley, yet the officer's report does not address this issue. There is inadequate drainage capacity as identified in the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan Policy 31. Condition 4 states there can be no occupation until a development and infrastructure plan is agreed with Thames Water. Essentially, this means that this development cannot help to address the 5-year housing land supply because the houses cannot be occupied until the sewage system and treatment facilities have been upgraded. This is also a material change since the development was last refused. Thames Water wanted this as a pre-condensement condition, and officers have put it pre-occupation. You can understand why this is a huge difference. The proposed leap is under a 132 kV power line along the southern boundary. Will parents really want their children to play here? Councillors, I urge you please to review this planning application, safeguard this site and the neighbourhood plan. Site cannot be returned to green space once it is developed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We have Colin Keeley, presumably he's online, is he? Colin, you have 4 minutes when you start speaking.
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, members. As members will be aware, the site has been considered twice before by the Council, the most recent application being the subject of an appeal recovered by the Secretary of State and subsequently dismissed in 2018. Though dismissing the scheme, the Secretary of State considered that there would be no impact on coalescence or harm to the character of Farnham, but there would be some harm to the general character and appearance of the area. This carried moderate weight against the appeal proposal. The Secretary of State also identified conflict with the principle of building on land outside of the settlement when judged against the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan, to which substantial weight was given at the time. There were positive aspects of the appeal scheme identified by the Secretary of State, and these carried through to the current proposals. These were that there would be no material harm to the appearance of the ASVI, that the development would not result in coalescence of Hale and Farnham, nor Hale and any other built-up area, that there would be no harm to the character of Farnham, the economic benefits arising from the scheme, and the housing benefits, including the provision of affordable housing. With regard to the current scheme, this differs from the appeal proposals in that this is an outline application and not a detailed application. It is a landscape-led design with a greater area devoted to open space and landscaping along the southern boundary. The proposed development area is smaller than on the previous scheme, and there is a higher percentage of smaller homes, which in turn provide more open space around the site edge and will provide strong green infrastructure. Section 1 of the officer's report sets out the determining issues in this case, of which there are 21. I won't list them here, but suffice to say that all of these issues have been addressed in our detailed submissions to the satisfaction of officers. As such, there are no technical objections. As is noted by officers, the National Planning Policy Framework affords a greater level of protection to neighbourhood plans where councils cannot demonstrate a 5-year supply of housing land. However, this protection does not apply where neighbourhood plans are more than 2 years old, as is the case with the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan. Government advice is that in these cases, planning permission should be granted unless the adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. The benefits of the scheme, as we've heard, include the provision of much needed market housing and an affordable housing provision of 40%, which is 10% above the policy requirement. Officers have concluded that the limited harm arising from the proposals will be more than outweighed by the scheme's benefits, a view which I concur. Members are aware of last week's ministerial statement and the proposed reforms to the 5-year housing land supply requirement. I would politely remind the committee that the proposals are to be the subject of public consultation, hence government advice is unchanged. In conclusion, given the policy support for the application and the absence of any adverse impacts that would outweigh the benefits of the scheme, I would respectfully ask that you accept the officer's recommendation and grant planning permission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keeley. Right, we have a ward councillor now, which is Councillor Mark Merriweather, again online. You have 4 minutes now and 4 minutes afterwards, if you so wish. Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me. Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry I can't actually be with you. In order to assess the harms arising from the proposal with regard to its impact on the countryside and the site's landscape designations, harms that other than for ASVI, I understand still carry substantial weight, it's worth rehearsing the site's location in detail because I don't think the description in section 3 of your report captures the appropriate detail. To the site's immediate north, the report tells us of some trees and the hedgerow, but not of the brook that runs along the northern side of Monkton Lane. Further north, we're told of the all-weather sports pitch and the day nursery, but not of the natural grass playing field surroundings in which they're set. To the immediate south, we're told of a track, a further belt of trees, the allotments, and even the Six Bells roundabout, but not of the large parcel of green space and woodland, just as large as the allotments and literally right next door to them to their east. Further to the south and east, we're told of the David Lloyd Centre and even the Thames Water Sewage Treatment Plant, but not of the large area of natural green space, woodland and playing fields that are actually closer to this site and in fact make up its entire southeastern aspect to the south of the Webburn Road. To the immediate west, we're told about the Hale Road and that's it, except that it shouldn't be because right there along the entire boundary to the west of the Hale Road is important natural green space linking this greenfield site through to Farnham Park. And finally, to the immediate northwest, the site description makes no mention of the site setting for all of the listed and other heritage assets described in the body of the report at the bottom of page 91. So this is an important greenfield site, and considering its impact on the whole area, the planning harms arising from the proposal cannot reasonably be described as just limited. If anything, they're the opposite, and they're so significant that they do demonstrably outweigh the questionable benefits that this proposal claims. Turning first to housing mix, the report clearly notes that there is an under provision of one-bedroom homes in the scheme, although it's compliant with affordability policy. But is it reasonable to offset the loss of those much needed one-bedroom homes with the marginal benefit of the few extra affordable ones when housing in our area is so expensive that even the definition of affordable is debatable? Affordability also impacts on infrastructure contributions. This report describes how most of the specific 106 contributions that were set under the appeal proposals will now be lost or subsumed into the far less tangible SIL system. It's concerning that the report credits the marginal affordable provision, but doesn't seem to detail at all the scheme's potential eligibility for SIL social housing relief and the adverse impact that would have on any SIL that would otherwise be payable. The local communities around this site have done their bit and have been very proactive in the identification of local development sites. And since the Secretary of State last considered this site in 2018, a further 334 homes have been provided on other sites just within a 1 kilometre radius of this one, of which 139 or 42% are affordable. Without this scheme, before you now, there would still remain a sufficient housing land supply to meet the minimum number of dwellings required by the local plan within Farnham. So members, at least for the time being, in terms of current policy, you are being asked to weigh planning benefits against planning harms on scales that are tilted in favour of development. But in the most key respects, I also believe that the harms of the proposal have been understated, while its benefits overstated. And when properly measured, the balance should still be in favour of refusal. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to listening to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Merriweather. Right, who wishes to open this debate? Nobody? Councillor Dixon. Yes, okay. If you could just make a clarification, yes, Bruce?
Yes, sorry, it was just to pick up on the point made by the speaker, Catherine Powell, in relation to condition 4 and the wording of that and whether it accorded with what Thames Water had suggested. And we have just checked that, and it what Thames Water have suggested is that no development shall be occupied until confirmation has been provided, etc., etc. It isn't a pre-commencement condition. So the wording to condition 4 is as per Thames Water's recommendation.
Councillor Dixon.
Good evening. Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I wanted to get straight onto the water issues. There's 2 water issues. There's foul water and then there's surface water. So when we look at this, there are several conditions applied to this application. There's condition number 4, which is to do with the foul water. And then there's condition number 6, which I think is to do with surface water. And then we've got condition number 24, which is to do with surface water as well. Now, interestingly, in the pack of information that we've had, there were 2 responses from the local flood authority. So there was the one response, which was the later of the 2, to which you refer to in condition 24. And then there was an earlier response, which you refer to in condition number 6. So I'm not an expert, but we've given 2 conditions about surface water. The other thing I wondered if Ruth could just clarify, we've said that this is from a fluvial flood risk, level 1. But we have clearly, because of all these conditions to do with surface flood risk, we're clearly admitting that there is a surface flood risk. I don't think the local flood authority has given us a vast number of conditions in condition number 6 to apply. And so therefore there is a surface flood risk. What I don't understand is why a surface flood risk doesn't attach to itself a level in the way that fluvial flood risks do. So if you have a fluvial, we've got level 1, level 2, level 3, and if it gets to level 3, then the housing has to have special barriers in the foundations to et cetera, but we're not saying what level the surface flood risk is. And I think if we look at this, we'd probably put it at level 3. And as a local councillor, and as someone who goes there a lot, there's massive amounts of flooding down there. I wouldn't want to live in a house there, having seen how much it floods, but I know my opinion doesn't count for very much. The one thing that is missing is that in the letter from Thames Water, they have 2 paragraphs. They have a paragraph about the foul water, and they have a paragraph about the surface water. And while the paragraph about the foul water is correctly captured in condition number 4, the paragraph about surface water does not appear to have been captured in either conditions number 6 or conditions number 24. So I would think it might be an idea to add the conditions of Thames Water to conditions number 6. But again, I'm not the expert. The other thing I was looking at is this foul water it is indicated in the letters from the residents. There have been 16 instances of sewage. Okay. There's been 16 instances. Let me just get to the right page so I say this correctly. Okay, just give me a minute. 16 instances where the sewers have overflowed. I think that's generally what they were saying. And so I'm a bit concerned that in conditions number 4, we have replicated what Thames Water says. But if you read Thames Water's letter, they say, we wrote to, and it says that Thames Water have no objection. Actually, Thames Water do not say they have no objection. They said they've written to the developer, they've had no reply. And as a bare minimum, they would require the 3 requirements for foul water capability to be, but we as local councillors and local inhabitants, and as the letters show from the local residents, know there is problems with flooding and problems with foul water in this area. So could we not tighten up this condition number 4? We've got logical operators, or so we like number 1 or number 2 or number 3. I would prefer to protect the people who are going to be living in these houses by putting and operators here to ensure that every single one of these lines is complied with, because we know that this is a massive problem and it is the highest number of foul water incidents in Waverley. The only other thing I'll say is, having pointed out why I don't feel the conditions are strong enough by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't think we've assessed the flood risk correctly, is that the marking housing provision in Farnham is met. I think, as Mark Merriweather pointed out, we've built a lot of houses within 1 kilometre of this, and we also have affordable housing in Farnham. So I really don't see why this one should go forward. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Shall I come back on all those points? So essentially, if I've understood your query correctly, it's about the sort of number of conditions that relate to various types of flooding, and effectively what they're covering. So we've got condition 4, as you've mentioned, is effectively in relation to foul drainage. Now, in terms of, so this is effectively, so you've got what points 1, 2, and 3. So they have to be ors rather than ands, because, so for example, point number 1, it may be proven that foul water capacity exists off-site to serve the development. So if they can demonstrate that, then you wouldn't need to do 2 or 3. So that is the rationale for the way that condition is constructed. Okay. So then, in terms of the surface water flooding, on page 85 of the report, it states that there are surface water flooding maps that you can access on the EA website. So a majority of the site is not in a high area of surface water flood risk, but there are 2 narrow overland flow routes on the edges of the site. Officers have had discussion with the lead local flood authority, so we've gone further than just accepting their response. We've actually had discussions with them about the surface water flood risk and the implications of having these 2 narrow overland routes. But the conclusion is that because the majority of the site is at a low risk from surface water flooding, and because SUDS would be incorporated into the scheme, that actually it wouldn't result in any harm. So we then turn to condition 6 that talks about, so they've submitted the principle of a SUD scheme that they put forward to the lead local flood authority, that they are in principle, they are satisfied with in principle, and condition 6 is effectively requiring them to provide further detail on that once they've worked up the detailed design of the proposal. Now, this sort of condition is standard on every application of this size to have a SUDS condition. So the SUDS condition isn't on because there is a particular issue in relation to surface water flooding. It is on there because providing SUDS is a requirement of every large scale application. And then condition 24 doesn't duplicate the SUDS condition, because condition 24 specifically relates to groundwater as opposed to surface water. So hopefully I have covered off the points in relation to drainage and flooding, but obviously do get back to me if it's still not clear. I think the only other thing that has been pointed out to me, and where the confusion may have arisen in relation to condition 4, is that I have put in the report in consultee responses that Thames Water have required various things prior to commencement of development. So apologies, the wording in the actual condition is correct. And then I think there is just one final point to make, which was your last point about housing provision in Farnham. And officers are very aware that there has been the grant of lots of planning applications in Farnham, and that the Farnham neighbourhood plan allocates sufficient sites for housing up until 2032. However, in terms of the application of the tilted balance, it has a borough-wide application and not a specific area-wide application. and hence the tilted balance still applies even in that scenario.
Excuse me. In condition 4, as I said, Thames Water said they hadn't been able to contact the developer. And they've suggested these 3 conditions, and they put logical operators or, you know, not and, but as a local authority, we know that there have been 16 instances of external sewer overflow, and this is detailed on page 66. And we have a Waverley Borough Council document to support that. So as the local authority, since that we are aware of the external sewage problem, we should be applying a stricter condition here and not just depending on Thames Water, who, as they say in the letter, have not managed to talk to the developer and actually don't know, but would say that. The other thing is about the surface water, is that all of this about surface water is talking about this site. And what is missed out is Farnham is built on hills. And it is not the surface water from this site that's the problem. As a local councillor, I can tell you, the problem is the water flows in from all over the place and floods this area because it's at the bottom of a hill. So actually it's not, you can't assess the risk of surface water just by saying, oh, I've looked at the site and this stream, because that's not where the problem comes from. The problem comes from water flowing in from all sides. And again, as local councils, as people who live here, we know this, and we should therefore take this into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Not to be monotonous, but condition 4, as I had already marked out after the speaker. So 4, 6 and 24, it's very interesting. 24 starts with prior to commencement. 6 says the development hereby permitted shall not commence. But number 4, which is the most, obviously the one that's even more contentious, says no development shall be occupied. So if we change 4 to either prior to commencement or shall not commence, it would be more evenly distributed amongst all the conditions. But that in my view, weakens the whole thing. If the others are all really solid, that number 4 is open to the, as I did show Councillor Dean, Dear, that I'd rung the word or on or, because you know, you can do it, or actually we might not be able to. So it could be they couldn't upgrade it, they can't do anything with it, and you're left with 56 houses unoccupied, ruining a green thing. Boom. You need to literally, in my view, I'm really sorry, but there's no consistency.
On this, I think.
Thank you, Councillor James. We can change that to prior to commencement for consistency purposes. I don't see there being an issue with it being that, but we would need to change our, which we can as well, we can update our recommendation to being subject to, because obviously a pre-commencement condition needs to be agreed with the applicant agent. So our recommendation would be that subject to that being agreed, that we would update that that condition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the presenting officer on one of the most impressive and lucid explanations of a really complicated subject I've heard sitting in this room. And we've had 3 speakers, it seems to me, who have focused on material planning considerations relevant to the actual discussion, which is, again, a refreshing change from things that sometimes happen. I'm slightly confused from the previous speakers as to whether they don't have a problem with this site and just simply want to talk about the fine detail of the conditions, or whether they're thinking about the principles of whether we should be consenting this or not. It seems to me to boil down to the changes in the NPPF and the changes to the 5-year housing land supply, which we no longer have. They seem to be the focus of the thing that we need to talk about, rather than necessarily at this stage the fine detail of conditions. From what I can see with the planning history, I mean, I understand that the changes in the NPPF, and I understand the changes in the housing land supply, but there still seems to me sufficient doubt in the weight to be attached to those changes that have been discussed. And I don't think it's sufficient weight to tilt the decision in favour of a consent when you have the background of a Secretary of State's refusal overturning a previous planning inspector's decision. Now, if that thought process is, if I've got that thought process right, then I think on balance I would be against this scheme. But if what I've said, if I've misinterpreted the nature of what the presenting officer said earlier, I'd be grateful to hear. But as things stand at the moment, I think, as I say, the weight to be attached doesn't overcome the decision that is, as far as I can see, is extant at the moment. Thanks.
Councillor Hunt, then Councillor Coburn and Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Chairman. So there's a couple of things, I guess. First of all, just to build on Councillor Deer's point, I agree with that. So there's been a lot of discussion about tilted balance. There's been a lot of discussion about the 5-year housing supply and also, possible changes there might be in coming up in the future. But it seems to me that in terms of this report, as clearly argued and clearly put forward as it is, when the weight is discussed, it's always almost assumed that the tilted balance would mean that it would go in the developers in their direction. It's never discussed, or it seems to me, having sat here for a while now, it's very rarely discussed that the tilted balance might actually fall in favor of it not being put forward. And the question I have is that when you have a report that's put together that is proposing that the development is granted, then surely there is some form of bias in writing that report towards favouring the tilted balance in respect of the developer, because the report is being written in favour of the development being granted, albeit trying to take a reasonably balanced view of it. The concern I have with this, and I am one of the ward councillors, so I speak as someone who lives very, very close by. As Councillor Merriweather said, within the last few years, there's been over 300 homes that have been built within a 1 kilometre distance of this site. 300 homes, another, I don't know, 500 cars, possibly. It seems to me that whilst in one respect, one needs to look at this as a site on its own, and it's a site and there are flood problems and everything else, and there's a boundary, and how many homes are going to be built on it and how many affordable, etc., etc. But you can't, it seems to me, you can't approve or disprove this without taking into account and context the slightly wide, the wider development of houses in this area over the last few years, of which there have been hundreds within a 1 kilometre distance, hundreds of homes, completely transforming the area, right? Now, even taking this site in isolation, Monkton Lane as an access point for 56 houses, possibly over 100 cars, if you live in that area and you know that area well, then you would know with no shadow of a doubt, and I don't care what the transport people, highways or whatever say, you would know there's no shadow of a doubt that is completely, completely illogical to try and have an access point there for another 100 cars or whatever coming in and out of there. The congestion around Six Bells Roundabout going up to the church is ridiculous day in, day out. The congestion along Webburn Road is ridiculous day in, day out, especially in the morning at commuters' times. You add another even 50 cars to that mix, it's just absurd. So I have issues about how the tilted balance and the weight of that is is put forward, even in respect of, you know, what we've discussed about housing supply and all the rest of it. And also, you know, yes, for the time being, there's a 5-year target, however long that lasts, you know, we shall see. But as you said, that's borough wide. That doesn't mean that all of those homes have to be built in Webber and Badshot Lee, of which there have been hundreds. So it may be that there's a borough-wide housing supply for 5 years, but that doesn't mean that another 56 houses need to be built on this particular site. And taking this particular site on its own, I still personally think there are enough issues that have been discussed in respect of access and also of flood that makes it unsuitable. So for me, I'm afraid that, you know, I would need to vote against. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Coburn.
I agree with everybody so far this evening. It's a very rare treat. I don't think there's any doubt the Secretary of State's opinion has to be taken into consideration. It's a very real, really material consideration in this matter. And also I agree so much with what Councillor Hunt has just said. And my frustration with the tilted balance and the slightly irregular interpretation of it is that, you know, it is up to the decision maker to decide on the weight of each policy. And that's as simple as that. You look at all the policies that have to be weighed in the balance, then you weigh it. And, you know, it is up to us as a committee or the officers to recommend the balance that's required. I would say, given what the Secretary of State has said, but I would also given the way the sites were selected. Councillor Merriweather pointed out the context of this site, and I was disappointed to see it just sort of on its own, because this site was deliberately left undeveloped, partly because of its designation and partly because of its situation. Because when we were assessing where building could go in Farnham, we looked at the whole of Farnham. You know, we did this, I'll say scientifically, I've said before, and I'm sorry to repeat, but, you know, we have been challenged in the courts and we have been found, you know, robust in this. So the site selection has been, or has passed the test of time, and it has been very successful in delivering houses where the people of Farnham said they wanted them to go. And as Councillor Hunt said, Badshot Lee did a survey and they took 200 without a second thought. And then we've had 1 or 2 more on appeal. So, you know, when I'm looking at this site, I'm looking at the principle, you know, why should we build on this site? What are the reasons for it? And if you build on this site, what will be the impact? And as far as I can see, the advantage to Farnham, the benefits are very limited. But the harm to this area, the harm to the neighbourhood plan, which is a full part of the development plan, whether or not it's lost its 2-year protection in paragraph 14, it remains an active part of the development plan, as of course does local plan part 1. And now we're told local plan part 2 is obviously going to be carrying more weight, although there are no new sites proposed in local plan part 2 for Farnham, because we actually reviewed, of course, you know, the first neighbourhood plan was 2017. When we discovered we were short of houses, we reviewed, and we're now up to speed with local plan part 1 as it was made in 2018. So, you know, to me, the principle of development on this site is just wrong. I can't see that there's any advantages that, or benefits, I was supposed to say, aren't we, that outweigh the harm to this for so many reasons. And, you know, it was interesting looking at the Lower Webburn Lane, which was another speculative development. Soon as the plan got to be 2 years old, in they came. But the Lower Webburn Lane one was actually refused by the officers, and I think rightly so, because to me, the issues are absolutely the same in both instances. So I think with the backing of the Secretary of State and the previous history on this site, I think personally that the harm completely outweighs the benefits of any development on this site. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, yes, I agree wholeheartedly with what Councillor Coburn has said, other than the issue of the tilted balance, of course, because Councillor Hunt wrong, we haven't talked about the tilted balance. We've heard a lot of people say the tilted balance is engaged, and we're meant to just take that as read. But when you That's if we ignore paragraph 182 of the NPPF completely. Throw it out the window, throw the law out the window, and just let's blindly accept that the tilted balance is engaged, which it isn't by fact. The fact is that paragraph 182 says you have to have an appropriate assessment in order for otherwise this is for habitat developments in the area which might have an impact. So we have to have an appropriate assessment. And if members don't believe me, then I'll ask the officers to read out paragraph 182 for you. But if you all accept that 182 says that, which I think you should, it does, as a matter of fact, officers I'm sure will confirm it, then we need an appropriate assessment. And if you read page 95, paragraph 31, at the end of the first paragraph, it says an appropriate assessment has been undertaken for the site. That's false. We know that's false because it will be in front of us. People will be waving it in my face and saying, here it is. We have got a detailed assessment of how effective doing nothing to Farnham Park is as mitigation. And of course, doing nothing doesn't make any difference. So there is no law requiring us to provide imaginary mitigation for developments which breach our policy. We don't have to. In fact, the law says we must not do that. So if anyone can provide me with a detailed assessment of Farnham Park's efficacy, then well, you would have done so if you could, just to shut me up, wouldn't you? And you can't. So please, let's be honest about this and let's look at this properly. I hope the officers will confirm that in accordance with paragraph NPPF 182, the tilted balance is not engaged. So please, everybody stop saying it is, because you're wrong. As a matter of fact, this site can't be screened.
Okay.
The landscape, it is contrary to landscape, RE1.
Simon.
Thank you, Chair. There are a couple of points we'd like to come back on. In terms of the habitats point, that's the point we've already covered. So I'm not intending to.
We haven't got an appropriate assessment. Put it in front of us and it's covered.
Let the officers answer the question.
Thank you. Apologies, we're having a bit of difficulty in giving some answers, but I mean, like I say, I'm not intending to address that further. We have got an appropriate assessment on the file, but the one thing I did want to make sure that I had addressed is there's a number of comments about there's particular comments about the report being biased in the way that it was balancing matters. Now, what we have done in our reports and what we have done in a number of reports recently is we have identified harm. And we haven't looked to downplay those harms, and those harms in this instance are consistent with the Secretary of State's decision. And the difference is obviously in applying the tilted balance, we're then coming out at a recommendation for approval. But one thing we're not doing is downplaying those harms in the report. It's simply the case that when the tilted balance applies, we've got to apply it in the way that we do, which is that those harms have to significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. The other thing we spoke about borough-wide, and I think what we want to make sure we clarify is that when the tilted balance applies, it applies across the borough, and therefore, the points that have been making about provision within one particular area, albeit there is some relevance to it. It doesn't disapply that tilted balance. Ruth wanted to.
Yes,
if that's okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to add in something else that I think is really important that members appreciate, and that is that the tilted balance almost does two things. So it effectively says that your development plan is out of date, and that comprises the local plan part 1 and the neighbourhood plan. And once the plan is out of date, you can apply less weight to those policies. So if we go to the Secretary of State's decision, where he talks about moderate weight against the proposal and the conflict with RE1 and RE3, FMP 10, FMP 11, and then substantial weight to the fact that the development is outside the built-up area boundary, that was in the situation where there was a 5-year supply, so full weight was applied to those policies. We're in a circumstance where full weight cannot apply because by the virtue of the tilted balance, the policies are out of date. So you have that happening on one side of the scales, whilst on the other side of the scales, you've got to increase the benefit to, and I appreciate that some people don't see them as benefits, but they have been considered, they are always considered benefits in these situations in terms of the provision of market and affordable housing where there is a housing need. So you can place less weight on your planning policies, and at the same time you have to place more weight on the benefits that are being proposed. So the tilt is almost a double effect. And I think that is a really important point to get across when we're looking at what the Secretary of State said in terms of weight in a circumstance where the tilted balance was not engaged, which I think is why the appeal inspector for originally only put limited weight on the harm because the policies are out of date because we didn't have a 5-year housing land supply. The Secretary of State could afford to put more weight on the harm and the conflict with the policies because we had a 5-year housing land supply.
Well, yes, because I always assumed that we had to determine all policies in accordance with the development plan, unless there were reasons not to. You know, that was the stress, that's what's in law, because the NPPF is guidance, it's not law, it's not statutory. So, you know, you have to determine your applications in accordance with the development plan, unless, you know, and then of course we've got the tilted balance and you've got lower weight to certain policies, but not to the development plan. And the development plan is still sacrosanct in planning as long, you know, as you also look at the policies and weigh them. But I mean, you have to prove that it's against the development plan, surely.
Yeah, sorry, just a couple of comments. I mean, less weight obviously doesn't mean no weight. And it seems to me that people come to different conclusions because they interpret it differently. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had a different conclusion from the inspectorate as opposed to the Secretary of State. So they've obviously interpreted, and, you know, albeit there may have been some changes, I think you mentioned, in policy during that period. But they've obviously, you know, the individuals who are reading the reports and the various pros and cons are giving different weights to different policies and different pros and cons, and they interpret it slightly differently. Secondly, in terms of housing need, yes, I completely understand the policy may mean borough-wide. There's no housing need in Webden and Bagshot Lee because they've taken 300 homes. All right. So, you know, I understand that, you know, it may come down to policies and all the rest of it, but it seems to me there's no benefit to this for that local area, for Farnham, apart from meeting this housing target for the borough that needs to be met. That's just the point I wanted to make.
Thank you very much. Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Chairman. I was on the site visit and I looked and I thought to myself, well, yeah, we've got Radford Close at the top there and Hale Place opposite, which have been built. And so the impact on the old Hale Farm building at the top there would not be excessive. But having heard today's debate and thought about it, I do agree with what has been said in respect of the setting of St. John's Church, as when you come up the A325 from the Six Bells of Tin Hut roundabout. So I do think it's contrary to HA1, FMP1, HE2, HE3 in that respect, because it can't be screened, as has been said. I think it's been established that this is contrary. It is a departure from policies RE1, RE3, FMP 10 and 11 in respect of landscape, as Councillor Coburn said. I'm not certain on flood risk NPPF 153 because I don't know that off by heart and I'd like someone to read it to me before I could decide. And I think other members should have it read to them before they decide. But I do know that the issue for me here in respect of flood risk is the increase of flood risk in other areas due to increased runoff from this site. And in the absence of infiltration testing before this came to us, I don't think we should grant consent for something which is going to possibly cause more flooding down at we call Stinky Bottom or whatever we call it now, the new estate down by the sewage farm. because that is where all the runoff goes down to, and increased in concrete without development on this field, without looking at infiltration rates and the viability of SUDs, just assuming that at a later date we can sort this problem when we may not be able to. We should not be granting consent to something, I don't think, in that way. I'd like to see condition 5 if you know about it. I really would like to see that. In terms of the roads issues, Monkton Lane was closed when I was a kid, late 70s, in order to do a lot of repairs to Hale Farm, where the building had been hit many times over the years. And Monkton Lane could be reopened. There is no, having walked it, it is dangerous for school kids as people wander up and down there, and cars do fly up and down. And we cannot assume that Monkton Lane, without any pavements on it, will remain safe. The idea of pedestrian refuge in the road at the bottom, we looked at that, and I don't think it's big enough for cyclists to stick their bikes there without getting hit by cars coming through, or people with mothers with pushchairs and whatever. I don't think that's satisfactory. I think in time, if we're going to put in developments like this, we will need a roundabout at that junction with Webburn Lane at the bottom of the top part of Monkton Lane. So there are numerous reasons that remain for refusal, but I do think that we should be able to be honest about the tilted balance. We keep being told that the MPPF 182 doesn't exist, and there's an assessment that doesn't exist, does exist. And honestly, I mean, what's the point in being a councillor if we're not allowed to look at what's fact and what isn't fact, and what's imaginary and what people would prefer to not admit because they've been wrong for years. So,
That's a matter of opinion.
No, it's not. It's a matter of fact, because if you can't put an appropriate assessment in front of me, which is legally compliant, then you can't. And telling me in this assessment in here that we've done it when we haven't, I mean, if you're willing to take responsibility, Chairman, for that, but because I don't want to criticise the officers, but it's got to go through you. We are being told here that an appropriate assessment has been undertaken, and the courts have determined what an appropriate assessment is and isn't, and it has to assess the effectiveness of mitigation, and that's Farnham Park, and no one's put an assessment in front of us. If anyone here can put it in front of me now, do it. I challenge you. Do it.
Well,
but so
long enough.
The tilted balance is not engaged.
Long enough, Councillor Hyman.
And if we're not allowed to hear the truth in this chamber, what's the point in being?
You cannot accuse the officers of being dishonest in any way. Councillor Hess.
A lot of technical stuff flying around the chamber tonight. I just come back to policy FMP 10. Priority will be given to protecting countryside from inappropriate development. A proposal for development will only be permitted where it would, there are 1 or 2 other clauses, but this one, retain the landscape character of and not have a detrimental impact on areas shown on map E as having high landscape value and sensitivity. Now, look, fundamentally for me, I hear about appropriate assessments, tick that box, sewerage, surface water, tick that box, Farnham fulfilling its housing numbers, tick that box, the huge number of houses which have been built in the Badshot Lee Webburn area, tick that box. But for me, fundamentally, it comes back to the issue of coalescence. Because when you walk through or cycle through or drive through that area, you've got green open spaces to your left and to your right. And we know that the developers are eyeing up the area and have been for years, and they treat it like a jigsaw puzzle, a piece at a time. We know this is happening, we see it happening. And quite frankly, a lot of fellow councillors here tonight have put up very good reasons why they're not happy about this particular planning application or outline planning application. And I think they're very valid reasons and all the technical ones. But for me, it's the coalescence. These green spaces will be filled up piece by piece. It's where will it stop? Where will that protecting the green spaces and stopping the coalescence stop? Frankly, it has to stop here, because if this particular application was granted, it would just lead to another one on the other side of the road. I was down there for the site visit, and I was struck, you know, that if this one got granted, it would perhaps be a year, maybe 2 years' time. On the other side of the road, there'd be an application for a similar number of houses. Coalescence would be a thing of the past. And as somebody said earlier in this chamber, once those green open spaces are built on, they are gone forever.
Oh,
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much, Councillor. All I'll say to that is you can't guarantee that it would lead to such an application. Would you add something to the roof for?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on 2 points that have been raised. The first one was raised by Councillor Hyman in relation to the impact on the assessing of the heritage assets. And I would take you back in relation to that to the inspector's decision and the Secretary of State's decision on that. And it's quite explicit in paragraph 23 of the Secretary of State's decision that he agrees with the inspector that the development proposed would not affect the ability of the public to appreciate or interpret the heritage significance of those buildings. So at the time of that full application of 56 units, it was considered that there was no harm to the assessing of the heritage assets. What we have before us is an indicative master plan. So if there is concern that the indicative master plan affects the assessment of the heritage assets, I'd just like to remind councillors that that master plan can change and the layout can change. And I think also just to point out that actually on that indicative master plan, it shows that you can have development that sits further away from the western boundary of the site and therefore further away to those listed buildings than occurred under the previous scheme. And I think actually Councillor Hyman referred to the fact that the officer's report talks about the fact you can't screen the site, but that was effectively in relation to the eastern boundary, not the western boundary, which would be the one that would be pertinent with assessing of the listed buildings. And the only other thing I think I want to point out, and I completely appreciate that members have concern about this, the impact of this proposal on the countryside. It is very clear from the Secretary of State's decision at paragraph 20 that he agreed with the inspector that there'd be no material harm to the appearance of the ASVI and that the development proposed would not result in the coalescence of Hale and Farnham or in any harm to the character of Farnham. So it's very clear from that that it was considered that the proposal wouldn't have a harmful impact in terms of coalescence. Thank you, Chair.
Is it a quick one?
To conclude, I mean, I feel for the officers because, you know, the benefit of building houses is such a big, you know, mountain to climb that we need to, so I'm trying to help. I'm really trying to help. When I point out that Thames Water, they didn't object, they did not object. They gave loads of conditions to do with foul water and surface water. We've had 2 responses from the local water authority on how to manage the water issues here. So we've got 3 or 4 very complicated conditions on this application to do with managing foul water and surface water. As we've also known that in this area, we've had 16 sewage leaks. The water goes down Upper Hale Road and it is a real problem. And as local people have responded and local councils are saying, this is a flood risk, there are sewage problems. So I'm trying to help the officers here because this is a very technically difficult site to build on because of the sewage risk and the surface water risk. And when they go back and we look at these conditions, which they've said they will do, can we not say that can we refuse it because these issues are too difficult to resolve and too difficult for us to monitor and check before or after the houses are built? Thank you.
Councillor Murray, another 4 minutes if you so wish.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to thank everybody for a thorough and thoughtful and well-considered debate. It's been quite a privilege to listen into it. And thank you to Councillor Powell for her contribution as well. I think it was Councillor Hunt who kind of nailed it for me. That these are subjective concepts, and the answer is in the eye of the beholder. If they weren't subjective, you know, who would need planning committees? Who would need inspectors? Who would need a Secretary of State for these things? It would all be much more cookie cutter than that. What I tried to do on the fundamental issues was drill down to why is this site located in countryside beyond the green belt? What does that mean? Why is it important? Why is it important? I get the point that the issue of the area of strategic visual importance has been neutered, but it is still also outside of the built-up area boundary. And what does that mean? And what I tried to do was to identify some of the elements that justify those designations and the kind of things that will have to be considered. I appreciate that there are benefits to this, but what I wanted to do was to put them in context. 10% on top of the allocated affordable housing is not to be sniffed at, but if that is offset by lower than policy 1-bedroom housing provision, and if that is at the expense of infrastructure contributions, we shouldn't just ignore that. It has to be taken into account. So it is a balance. However tilted, it's still a balance, and it's only right and proper that we put all of the evidence onto the scales and present it fairly and make up our minds. In terms of the conditions, I think also there that we ignore our experience at our peril. The residents of Brook Avenue, just up the road, will tell you for as long as you can put up with it, how the runoff off of Roe Hill from the uphill landscape down into Webburn is even more significant a factor here than the water that actually falls on the property. Surface water drainage in this area is an issue and does need to be considered. And those people who are waiting to work to move in to Monkton Place just down the road will tell you the importance of the difference between a pre-commencement and a pre-occupation planning condition, because those houses, a lot of people would say that a lot of those houses, some of the conditions should have actually been pre-commencement rather than pre-occupation. It would have saved a lot of people a lot of angst. So there's one last point I wanted to make, and thank you. This is at the prompting of Councillor Powell. Is that so much of the discussion we've had on those particular aspects, the drainage and the sewage and so on, has been in the context of how we are reacting to the water that's coming in, and how we are putting in the various measures that may be needed to deal with things as they are. Certainly, yeah. And I am reminded that, in fact, we should be proactive and we should be planning for climate change and not just reacting to circumstances as they come out and ambush us. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for listening. Thank you all very much for a very, very good session.
Thank you very much. Well, we move to the recommendation, and I think it's a hybrid here actually, because we move to the revised recommendation, which is approved subject to the revision of a 106 agreement to secure within a period of 6 months, I assume, To secure SANG and SAM contributions, provision of 40% affordable housing, setting of the market and affordable housing mix, provision of travel plan vouchers, provision of SUDs and public open space along with the management and maintenance, and a landscape ecological management plan subject to conditions and informatives, and the conditions will be revised. And informatives on the agenda, but an additional condition 32, which is on the handout. Then the granted, and the recommendation be that in the event of the requirements of recommendation are not met, i.e. section 106 within 6 months, then permission will be refused. Those in favour, please raise their hands. Well, thank you. Those against, please raise their hands. And abstain. The result, please.
Thank you, Chairman. That is none in favour, 12 against and no abstentions. Therefore, the application has been lost.
Therefore, we require an alternative recommendation. Go on. We can.
I propose that permission should be refused. I have reasons.
Hang on a second. Oh, sure. I think Councillor Dan Hunt, I think, was quickest off the mark there. Right.
Shall I go? Sorry, were you waiting? I wasn't quite sure you're waiting for. I think we should, use something like the quantum of development proposed on an unallocated greenfield site, and the urbanizing impact of the proposed development would fail to enhance or protect the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. I think it would contribute to coalescence of settlements, but I'll take advice from the officers. But certainly the erosion of the landscape character, I think, is relevant if you won't let me have coalescence.
So that officers, I've got some wording with him to provide. Ruth?
Right, okay, so I think what we're cobbling together is the proposed development located outside of the built-up area boundary and in countryside beyond the green belt on an unallocated greenfield site would have an urbanising impact on the landscape character that would cause material harm to the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. Contrary to policies RE1 and RE3 of the local plan part 1 and policies FMP 10 and FMP 11 of the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan 2013 to 2032, and also given what we've said about local plan part 2 coming forward, we would feel it appropriate to refer to emerging policy DM15 of the local plan part 2, which is the policy that relates to development in rural areas and talks about recognising the natural beauty and undeveloped character, which is intrinsic to the open countryside.
Well,
yeah, just wanted to add a couple of policies, if I may, the two that I always add. One, because FNP1 is always, it's our overarching policy for design, and that's whether it's one house or 56. And 14, which everyone leaves out, but our paragraph 14 explains why we selected the sites. It's not just a list of the sites. Once we've explained how they did the selection, 14A is one site, 14B is another, but paragraph policy and FMP 14 is all about site selection.
Do you want to comment on that? Can we comment on that?
Yes, I think we can add in FMP 14. I often read policy FNP1 as more commenting on the design detail, but I know, I know it has been in other appeal decisions on other sites in Farnham. So yeah, let's put FMP1 in. So we have RE1 and RE3, not necessarily for coalescence, more for countryside impact, FMP10 and FMP11, FMP14 and DM15.
MP31, the waste and sewage infrastructure capacity. Yeah.
Well, we don't have that as a reason for refusal. The Secretary of State explicitly said in his decision that he was happy with regard to sewage in relation to the development. I think that would be tricky to defend on appeal myself.
Yeah, it may not be the case, but I mean, defending it. Councillor Davison?
I was going to actually reinforce what Councillor Dixon has just been asking for. As she's pointed out, the assessment by Thames Water seems to be in isolation. And I think if it is at all possible, to try and bring in the fact that this needs to be put into a context of existing flooding within that area as a concern which needs to be addressed.
I'll have to refer to officers.
Oh, thank you. It's a bit of a tricky one, this, because the site can't be required to put right other, other issues that are off site that potentially it can't be required to address other areas issues. And I think, as we've said before, it wasn't the reason previously. So in terms of consistency, I would have some concern as well.
But on environmental grounds, are we allowed to sort of encourage houses to be built on a floodplain, for example, just because the local water authority or utility thinks, yes, that looks okay? No, I think not.
And also,
I got lost in all the discussion. I mean, is it true to say that we've got insufficient information? I mean, about that. We've said in one decision that there was insufficient information has been provided, to satisfy. In this case, it was the lead local flood authority that the proposed drainage scheme is satisfactory, and of course, bringing in policy CC4 and FMP 31. I mean, is that what I don't know is whether we have had is sufficient information. It sounds as though it's been all over the place. That's why I'm asking.
So in terms of surface water flooding, the lead local flood authority are satisfied with the information that has been submitted so far that covers off sort of the principle of how SUDS would be dealt with. And so then they have applied that condition, a number of which I can't remember off the top of my head, that would cover off the details. So at this moment in time, they feel that they have got sufficient information in that respect. In terms of foul drainage, Thames Water need more information in order to ascertain whether there is sufficient capacity or whether upgrading works need to be done to ensure there's sufficient capacity. But I would say in this instance that can be covered by a condition, and it has been made more robust by making it a pre-commencement condition. And the Water Authority is under an obligation under other legislation to provide the sewage infrastructure. So I would resist refusing on those grounds. And I think in relation to groundwater as well, because we've had conversations with the lead local flood authority, and I think they're satisfied as long as that condition 24 goes on, that would also be acceptable, given that there's no evidence of groundwater flooding on the site. Thank you, Chair. Sorry, mustn't forget another 2 reasons for refusal, because there wouldn't be a legal agreement towards SANG and SAM contributions. So we'd have a reason for refusal about the applicant failing to enter into an appropriate legal agreement to secure that contribution. And we'd have a reason for, so contrary to the Habitats regs, and a reason for refusal based on lack of legal agreement to secure the provision of affordable housing. I can read those out, but they're the sort of standard ones.
Are we all happy with that?
Chairman, no, Chairman, can we look at transport traffic safety issues here, because the pedestrian refuge and footpath on Monkton Lane are a consideration, surely, that we don't want. Sorry? In that case, could I have it minuted, please, that I wish to be on record as stating that there is no appropriate assessment. If other members are going to just deny it, that
Yes. So those in favour of refusal on the ground stated, please raise their hands. Those, I've got to go through this, come on. The result, please, Kimberly.
Unanimous, and everybody's in favour.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay.